talk to on the phone and walk them through what all goes into chat and how it should and should not be used when they start looking at lands bills. I think there was a lot of emphasis in making sure you check in with the local communities, county advisory boards, biologists from NDOW, whoever the appropriate people may be. So at this point, I'm comfortable with the letter. I would suggest maybe a few minor revisions that the commission's comfortable with. And again, attaching the correspondence, whether it was correspondence in support or correspondence suggesting some changes to our letter, just so the congressman has the full package. And I would be able to try to answer any questions you may have at this point.
Questions from Mr. Drew from the commission? Commissioner Hubbs.
Yes, Jeremy, I read through the letter, and I know at our last commission, or I think it was our last commission meeting, or maybe the commission meeting before, when we looked over the map, and then the initial correspondence didn't appear to touch on sensitive species, but after we reviewed the map in detail with Mr. Janae, we saw that in fact that map did envelope all those areas or habitat for hunting and for other wildlife of concern. So I feel comfortable with that. But interestingly, Tina Knapp's idea, does this include sensitive species also, again came to my mind just when reviewing this draft. And I think when I was looking down here under the second sentence, it says identify areas of critical hunting habitat or hunting areas within those areas. If we can somehow maybe open that comment up, because then again, it looks like we're just thinking about hunting areas, and I know we are looking at all different types of areas with hunting included.
Yeah, great question, Jeremy Drew, for the record, just to address that. I think that quote was actually the email request that was made to us. But certainly, I think the input we're providing back is much broader than that. And so I'm absolutely fine incorporating that into the narrative to make sure that our letter and our maps actually represent more than what they had asked for. And that includes basically all wildlife habitat.
Further questions or comments? Thank you again, Mr. Drew, for all the work you put into getting this put together.
And just to address that comment or that concern is we did provide the chat methodology to the Congressman's staff, so they have all of the background, that everything that goes into this, and much more detail than they ever needed.
I know that I'm comfortable the way this is written. Is there any edits that the commission would like to include? Commissioner Barnes.
I guess I don't have any no edits to be made in our area. There's a lot of that checkerboard ground. We've been some ranches up there have been blocking it up, and a lot of times it makes management a lot easier. I mean, as far as even for the BLM management, and as well as for the public or the private landowner. And when I saw that, was my first concern, is that we don't want to. I don't think we want to stop some of that, because a lot of that is a benefit. But I think the way it's written, I think we still allow for that. Do you feel good about that, Jeremy?
Jeremy Drew, for the record, I do. I think Eureka County's point was that in a lot of those cases, it's really hard to have no net loss of public lands, especially when you talk about individual parcels. Again, I think the way we state that is it's a goal of this commission, and so I think blocking things up from my standpoint makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a lot of things you can do where you block up private ownership around towns or the I-80 corridor, for instance, but maybe instead of doing a direct transfer, you do an exchange. So you pick up some of those private lands that are on a cliff or something and put them back into public domain, and it helps balance that out. Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act's a good example too. While it's not no net loss of public lands, they're taking those funds and actually reinvesting them back into conservation. And so I think we also mentioned that in that last bullet point. So from my standpoint, I'm comfortable with it. But if there's something that needs to be clarified, again, no pride of ownership. It was simply trying to get those points in. If there's clarifications that need to be made, I think they're pretty simple to make.
Thank you, Mr. Drew. Further questions or comments from the commission before I go to public comment? Commissioner Almberg.
Yeah, I think in the letter problem and trying to encourage Development of bring out these special services.
Thank you, Commissioner Olberg. Further commission questions or comments? Being none, this is an action item. I'll take it out for public comment for agenda item number 18.
For the record, Paul Dixon, Clark. I'll start with saying that the CAB supported the letter. Question that was brought up by the CAB members is, as we block up land or we do parcelization, and there's no net loss, you have the wording in your mind, Jeremy, in a way that does not have net loss of access to public lands as you block things up in there. So in other words, so that we block up an area where it used to have a zigzag path for people to get through back into something. Now have access around or through that property as we do that. That was the question my CAB had, and I didn't have enough knowledge of everything.
Come on up, Mr. Drew.
Jeremy Drew for the record. Just to address that, I think we do talk pretty specifically to both wildlife habitat as well as access to public lands, especially surrounding these parcels. Eureka did have a question, obviously if a parcel goes into private ownership, you're going to lose access to that parcel. But in doing so in these land deals, a lot of times you can convey it subject to the existing and valid rights. So you can leave any public easements in those parcels, or you can make arrangements in the process to provide public access around that parcel. And in a lot of cases, there's multiple public access points in that area, depending on who you talk to. So I think there's plenty of ways to work through those access issues. It just takes, I think, as we state in the letter, a lot more input and creativity at the local level to make sure those things are addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Drew. Come on up, Walt.
Walter Mandeville, Lyon County Board. Yeah, when I seen this, I thought, yeah, we've got to be very cautious with the government giving up the land, and I don't think it's a very good idea. As a wildlife biologist, I dealt with a lot of development that came into the area, and we've lost a huge number of mule deer over a number of these developments. If you around the Reno area, Carson, the whole works. And development is probably good for the economy, but I visited my son in Ohio, and I drove up and down the highways trying to find some place where I could wander. There's nothing. There is no place to go. I can leave my house in 2 minutes and be out there in no place land. And that's a wonderful thing, in my opinion. And as a wildlife biologist, I really enjoyed, working with mule deer and bighorn sheep and all those things that we value. And I'll tell you, I commented on development after development to try to reduce the impact on the herds. And I know, a lot of those herds have almost totally disappeared in some cases. The migratory paths and all those things that we need to consider. And I don't know, I don't think the state has the ability or the resources to manage what is now public lands. I don't think they can do a good job of it. We just don't have those resources. Water developments and all the rest of that. And I don't know what your guys' thought are on it, but it's something that I want to try to go very cautiously with this. I know the government wants to get rid of a lot of that because it's costing them money. But it's up to us to decide which way we want to go. I appreciate your listening to me, and so I'm done. All right, thank you.
Thank you all. Mr. Gurr.
Good morning, Commissioners. For the record, Bert Gurr, Elko County CAB Chair. We reviewed the letter, and the letter seems to be fine in the direction it's going from what we could tell. We also reviewed the maps. And the maps were small. It was hard to really pick out the areas. It was, we need some more work in Elko County through it, but we think the draft is appropriate. We like the no net loss figure. Access is going to be the biggest discussion item in Elko County. I know it is. Listening to the board. We didn't have any public there, so it was just the board discussing it to speak of, unless you include the two department people that were there. But in the big picture, we've already lost tons of access in Elko County on the checkerboard lands, and I don't know that you guys are aware of it, but you probably are if you've been in Elko County, but there's a lot of spots up there that people have bought the private sections in that checkerboard, then throw a gate up and a lock on it and say, you can't go through, even though it goes onto the railroad and goes other places. So there's gonna be a whole lot of discussion before it ever gets through the process. And I know that I met with two of the county commissioners that are pushing the transfer of government land to the state and or the management of the public lands to the state of Nevada. And I think that's the direction they're going. And they like the letter too. They like the direction of the letter, at least in the conversation we had. So it wasn't a full commitment from the county commission, obviously. We didn't have an agenda meeting, but it was just a discussion because we missed part of this, I guess, in our agenda. And it just didn't quite come out that way. But we're in favor for the most part of the draft and the way it's written. It looks good to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gurr.
Karen Boger for the record, Backcountry Hunter and Anglers. Chairman Wallace and Commissioners, thank you so much, Mr. Drew, for this final brilliant gift you've given us, because I think it's an excellent letter, succinctly written, and very much supporting what this commission had related to both Congressman Amadei and other supporters of land transfers in this state. And I know I've already written you a long letter, but I would just like to say, because I didn't talk about the no net loss issue, I think it's good to state that as a goal, because having participated in a number of county public lands bills and the pine forest process, I can say that having that as a goal really causes us all to get creative in thinking about how to have a win-win solution. And I think that in the pine forest bill, certainly we did exactly that with exchanges. And the Pershing County bill as well, with blocking up some areas in the checkerboard for wildlife values and blocking up other to go to private. So I commend that as a goal, although that's sometimes difficult, granted. Also, the question about access. This last legislature, the Backcountry Hunter and Anglers supported a legislation about corner crossing, and that is primarily in checkerboard, where you get that diamond effect of where there's just one little point where you cross from public to public or private to private. And we tried to get that corner crossing legislation passed, and it did hit some problems and didn't pass, but we will come at it again. And I'd just like to say, if you don't know much about it, in our latest journal, we have an article about that, but hope to be talking to you about that in the future. And last of all, I just want to say that the fact that Congressman Amadei came to you saying, I really want to know what are the areas that of the proposed disposals are important to you and to wildlife and wildlife habitat, is a beautiful sign that he really heard our loud voices as a collective sportsman and conservation community and your voices as a commission. So thank you very much for your work on all our behalf.
Thank you, Ms. Bozier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bevan Lister for the record. I'm representing myself. I didn't see the letter until last night and only read through it briefly. I didn't have tremendous issues, except in the concept of what are we really trying to accomplish. from my perspective, the very best wildlife habitat that we have in the state of Nevada is the wildlife habitat that is immediately around private property, where water is flowing and things are being grown. The concept that the government's trying to get rid of land is false. The public land base throughout the state and throughout the nation consistently increases. And the drive to limit public land disposal may sound good in Washoe and Clark counties, but if you're in a place like Lincoln County where 1.8% of the county is private land, 98.2% is public. I don't know if you have any idea what kind of a challenge that creates for local government and for local economy, as well as for wildlife management. Public land is non-managed land. You understand that? Everybody understands that? The BLM does not actively manage land. They only manage uses. So land that we face, you've faced, you've seen all the data on loss of deer habitat, loss of sage grouse habitat, loss of habitat, at the same time that wilderness and recreation and all those kind of specific designations have increased. Those are non-managed lands. Pinyon juniper encroachment is non-managed land. Decadent sagebrush is non-managed land. So I hope you'll understand the idea of no net loss means you will lose it all. There needs to be stewardship and ownership, and private ownership is far better taken care of, provides far better wildlife resources than any piece of native land sitting out there. Yeah, I've heard the argument about the old days, before white man came and the great grasslands in Nevada. Yeah, that's false. Whoever's telling that story is telling lies. The reality is land has to be managed. Federal government does not manage land. So in your capacity to make recommendations, understand that by severely limiting the opportunity for land to be disposed of or put into sound management, it limits your capacity for wildlife. And on the other side of it, I'm not real sure what you're afraid of. In 2002, the Lincoln County Land Recreation and Development Act was passed, and it designated 90,000 acres in Lincoln County for disposal. That was 15 years ago. They're working on a disposal right now. Not sure it's complete or not. That would bring the total disposed of in 15 years to 400 acres. So I wouldn't be too awful concerned about losing a whole bunch of it real quick. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lister. Further public comment? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for further discussion.
Mr. Chairman, I read through the letter several times, and I'm comfortable with it, and I think it's important that the rural and local communities are involved in the process, and that if the process comes forward and we're following the same process that Southern Nevada Public Lands did, then I think we're on the right course. I'm in support as written.
Thank you, Commissioner Valentine. Commissioner Hubbs?
I'm in support of the letter too. My only concern again was actually addressing that we've provided more information to the congressman, and however you want to incorporate that, unless you think it's going to be harmful to incorporate that. But I think it would let individuals know that there's a general concern not only for hunting habitat, but also for sensitive species, long-term, and that any type of land transfer would take that into consideration. So if there was any, I see a couple areas, but I'm going to leave that to the drafter. I think that Jeremy's more than adept at putting it in there where necessary. So with that slight input or adage to the letter, I would be fine with it as written too, just with a mention at least to the additional habitat that for sensitive species, if that's a flavor of the commission today.
Thank you, Commissioner Hubbs. Further commission comments? Commissioner Johnston?
I have received some public input on this, correspondence on various issues. I think it's uniformly been in support of the message that this letter is conveying, and I've said this in the past meeting. It's not that we believe that public lands are being managed well currently, but loss of public lands doesn't necessarily mean that anything would be an improvement upon what we have now, and there's a lot of concerns in that regard as to what disposal would look like, how would it occur, and who the recipients would be. So, read through the letter various times. Thank you, former Commissioner Drew, for drafting that. Have to find a replacement to draft these letters in the future, I guess. But thank you for that. I'm in support of it.
Commissioner Young?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in support of it as well, Jeremy. I have to go no further than look at private ownership in some of the rural counties and their reprehensible selling of water rights to the Clark County Water District, Southern Nevada Water District, raping wildlife and others of the natural use of water to feed more Californians moving to my county. So keep going, Jeremy.
Thank you, Commissioner Young. Further comments from the commission? Do I have any action from the commission? Commissioner McNinch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in support of it as well. I think it's broad enough to cover the concerns that I might have. So with that, I would make a motion that we approve the draft, the correspondence to Congressman Amadei's office as presented to us.
I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch with a second by Commissioner Almberg to support the letter as written. Questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 8-0, with Commissioner East absent.
Excuse me, Chairman. If I could, I just wanted to say one last thanks to Jeremy for his leadership on, this public lands issue and all of his participation in habitat issues through the years. I'll severely miss him, and again, I wanted to say thanks to Chad, another great advocate for Nevada's lands and habitats. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Janan. And I, on behalf of the commission, want to thank Mr. Drew for drafting that letter and all the hard work he's put into it. And I'm sure we will be in touch again over this. Thank you. That'll close agenda item number 18. And we'll move to agenda item number 19, County Advisory Boards to Manage Wildlife Workshop, opening comments, informational, Chairman and Secretary Wasley. Should we jump right into A, or?
We can certainly do that. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a few comments just about the process and the CAB workshop. So first, let me start by expressing gratitude at the participation and attendance representation from the various CABs today. A year ago, we held this meeting. Meeting was at our leased space on Sierra Center Parkway, and it was at the close of the meeting, and we had 4 CABs present. Subsequent to that, there was some discussion amongst this board that it would probably be a good idea to encourage CAB participation and across all issues and all meetings, but specifically attendance at this specifically designed CAB workshop to address some of the issues where there has been an expressed desire. We heard one of those issues today from Clark County CAB. There was a desire to bring up wild horses and burros. The last time we had that presentation on our agenda was at the CAB workshop a year ago at this meeting. We did have an in-depth presentation on the status. Subsequent to that, I think it's a surprise to anybody that we've had a change in administration in Washington, D.C. The discussions around wild horse and burros and the administration of that act is front and center. I think the week after next, there's a Wild Horse and Burro Summit in Salt Lake City that's by invitation only. It's anticipated that multiple governors may be in attendance, as well as the Secretary of Interior, Ryan Zinke. There's a desire to explore options that have perhaps previously been off the table. I can assure this board, as well as the CABs and interested public, that the department remains engaged. We will have staff in attendance at that summit, and we're happy to report back what some of those conversations and discussions sound like. The two portions of agenda item 19, the CAB workshop, there's A and B. A is a presentation from Game Division Administrator Brian Wakeling and some of our staff specialists, Cody Schroeder, and I see Cody McKee here as well, so I'm imagining he may participate in that. It was kind of prompted by comments made by both county advisory board members as well as some of the commissioners. We have gradual replacement and attrition on both this board as well as CABs, and sometimes in the department we take for granted that we talk about processes in survey and inventory and modeling and quota derivation, and so there was maybe some inaccurate assumptions on our part, but we heard from the CABs, we heard from the commission. I think Commissioner Hubbs, I think Commissioner Young, and some others, I think Commissioner Valentine, have all expressed a desire to better understand how we conduct our surveys and inventories and how that goes from the survey and inventory portion to the modeling portion to ultimately the determination of the quota that is brought forward to this board and the county advisory boards. So this item is in response to that expressed desire by the CABs and the commission to understand that process. The other item covered under the CAB workshop is another item that's been before this board and the county advisory boards recently, pertaining to the landowner damage compensation program for deer and antelope. Previously, we had a statutory limit on those tags of 1.5% of the previous year's quota. We exercised statutory relief there to make that 2.5 so we wouldn't be in exceedance of that limit this year, but we also committed to engage more broadly to look for some direction, some guidance, not only in how that program is administered, but also what we may consider as options in the future should we bump up against that statutory cap again. And so that's just a quick overview of the county advisory board process. Again, appreciate the attendance and representation. Lincoln County isn't here, but they let me know let us know that they wouldn't be here and sent their apologies. And with that, I guess I would turn over to Game Division Administrator Brian Wakeling for the mule deer management portion of this workshop.
Thank you, Mr. Director, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Brian Wakeling, Game Division Administrator with the Nevada Department of Wildlife. The department provided a briefing to the Commission just prior to the quota setting process that largely dealt with how we try to address the quota setting process. It was fairly abbreviated, and it was kind of crunch time just before we were actually trying to demonstrate what our recommendations were. And so we thought today would be a really good opportunity, and I'd like to echo my thanks to the cabs and everybody who chose to be here today. I know nobody likes to spend their weekends necessarily discussing mathematical formulas and things of that nature, but I think it really helps us get on a common understanding of how we try to move forward when we're trying to make recommendations, the considerations that we have. I'll give you a real quick overview of how we want to handle this presentation today. I'm kind of giving you this real broad overview, but I'm going to ask Cody Schroeder, our mule deer and pronghorn staff specialist, to come up and give a kind of reiterate that process that he went over in May, and provide everyone with an opportunity. And what we hope is that this will be a question and answer, that we can do this as kind of engage in dialogue as we present this. When we complete that, our specialist who's dealing with elk primarily at this point in time is Cody McKee. And while there's changes on the boards, there are changes on committees, we also have the opportunity to engage in innovation with the methods and the processes we use. And so Mr. Schroeder will probably address some of the modeling differences that we're looking into. Mr. McKee will also look into give you kind of an overview of some of the innovation we're looking at how we can do a better job conducting surveys. It's really great when we have our staff specialists speak to you. They're the ones that are providing program direction. They're kind of giving an overview of, we want to explore this scientific innovation, but ultimately where the rubber meets the road is with our field biologists and their implementation of the projects. And so one of the places where we've been using some of this field implementation was within Area 1617. The area biologist there is Joe Bennett. And we're going to ask him to speak to a little bit about how that's been working and ultimately how that works for him. And then what I want to do is come back and give a final kind of wrap up and talk a little bit about what we're trying to do as far as hitting the target when we're trying to use all this science. We routinely hear that science needs to really drive this. We want to really cover the scientific aspects of this today and kind of address how it hits the target. Before I do, before I turn this over to Mr. Schroeder, I would like to share, when I first came to Nevada, I was looking for, some background information and some work that may have been done before, and I stumbled upon a 1959 Legislative Council Bureau report. And in that document, it was a survey of fish and game problems in Nevada, and it made the observation, this is on pages 35 and 36, Fish and Game Administration is also complicated by certain human attributes without parallel in other democratic processes. It has been said that among the various attributes of the human male, 3 are almost universal. Each considers himself a good driver. Each, for a period at least, considers himself attractive to the opposite sex, and each considers himself expert in fish and game management. The only thing that I would note that may have changed over the time is I think this is now expanded to just not the average Nevada male. It might be the Nevada female as well. So we've come far. Hopefully that you would consider that to be a little bit lighthearted. But I'd now like to turn it over to Staff Specialist Schroeder and allow him to kind of address our current process.
Thank you, members of the commission. For the record, Cody Schroeder, Staff Specialist, Nevada Department of Wildlife. So some of the stuff I'm going to be presenting to you, you have already seen at the May commission meeting, but I do provide some sort of added detail to it. I just want to kind of touch bases with some of the stuff I put forth to you guys the first time, expand on those, and really look at where we're kind of looking to go in the future. So this conceptual diagram I have here you saw before, but it really does kind of lay out the whole process. Now this is sort of mule deer management as relates to the quota development, the harvest recommendations, things like that. And really the foundation where we start, the nuts and bolts of this process, is our survey and inventory. So critical part of our data collection is counting animals and inventorying different species. That data goes directly into our population models. And then at that point, we have sort of a divergence here. We're taking in harvest data in our modeling, but our harvest data also directly goes into our quota recommendations. So we're basically projecting what we think the harvest is going to be going into the quota recommendation process. So today we're just going to be focused on mule deer. Typically our surveys are conducted in the late fall, spring for mule deer. Some of our herds will actually survey twice a year, but we try to get at least one of these seasons for all of our herds that we survey. Now when I say late fall, that's typically right after the hunting season. So we try to avoid flying over hunters out there in the field. But we also want to know right after that harvest occurs what our actual bucks, how many bucks we have on the landscape is one of the reasons. And then in the spring, we're more interested in fawn recruitment. So in our fall counts, we typically classify bucks, does, and fawns. Ideally, we want to be as close to the rut as possible, and that is to minimize the bias in the sightability of bucks. So the peak of aggregation for these sexes, mule deer and many other ungulates, is basically the breeding season. They sexually segregate outside of that, and typically males are in small or even solitary groups, and so their detectability goes down after the breeding season. In our spring counts, we're typically classifying just adults and fawns. The males have lost their antlers at that point, and we calculate a fawn to adult ratio, and we consider that value our recruitment value that goes into the models. Now this is something that I presented at the Deer and Elk Workshop in Sun Valley, Idaho. We've been putting out GPS collars on mule deer since 2011. And we had an opportunity to collar bucks and does for a period of time. And what I'm showing here is this value on the y-axis. MCP stands for minimum convex polygon, and all that means is it's a home range estimate. And we calculated it on a daily basis for all the animals we had collared, both males and females. This is data from the Ruby Mountains in Area 10 and from the Simpson Park Mountains in Area 15. We did look at differences between, but for the purposes of this, I'm just going to show you the combined results. They were pretty much the same. So we define these periods as the pre-rut period, the rut period, and the post-rut period. Now that's just based on our sort of preconceived notions when we think it's going to occur. And you can see from that top panel there that when we looked at the difference between males and females during that pre-rut period, you've got sort of a static home range size, very similar to the female home ranges, but in that rut period, they increase their daily home range size by quite a bit. Now, there's a lot of variability there. Those are box plots with the interquartile range, and it's a little tough to see, but the black bar inside is the median value. And those are statistically significant. We used a modeling approach to sort of look at differences between males and females and the different treatments. So I think the second one really kind of shows a little bit better. Now this is the home range size on a weekly basis, and if you look at if you just kind of scan there on that middle panel and you look at the difference between males and females, you see that females pretty much are static throughout that whole period from week 40 to week 50. There's actually a slight decrease on week 46 on their home ranges, but the males, you see this progression starting about week 44. That's around the 1st of November. Last week of October, they start increasing their home range size, and it's really about that week 46 where you see the peak of the rut for Nevada. That's about November 10th to the 24th, roughly. The bottom one there is another metric I used just to see if the home range size was predicting accurately, but this is activity. So the collars have a switch inside of them. It's actually similar to the new ones to the accelerometer on your phone that has a little tilt axis in there, and it measures the amount of activity based on the angle that collar is sitting. So if they're wandering around throughout the day or trotting and things like that, it's going to count higher activity values than if they're just bedded. And so when we looked at males and females, we saw the same sort of pattern, that these males were more active during that, generally that week 46, whereas the females is just kind of a constant steady state throughout that whole time period. And so really from this we concluded that the peak of rut, at least in these two study areas we looked at in Nevada, as I mentioned, the Ruby Mountains and the Simpson Park Mountains, was between November 10th and the 24th. Now that's not to say that there isn't a little bit of activity before that, and we oftentimes hear about that when we're talking about season dates for our quotas and things like that. So there definitely is rutting, sort of pre-rutting activity before, but really the peak is around that week 46. And that's relevant to our survey period because we want to be as close to that as possible. The farther we get from that, we know that we're going to have a little more bias in that sample. As I mentioned, harvest data is a critical part of our quota recommendation process and the population models themselves. We have mandatory harvest reporting for all big game species. We typically get about 95% return rate on mule deer. And the number of animals that we harvested are removed from the population the following year. That's the kind of the take-home message here. That's one of the important things. When we don't get that high return rate, we do use an expansion factor. If for some reason we didn't get 80% of the return, we have to calculate in the number of unreported animals that we know were probably harvested. So we have an expansion factor for that. So a little bit about population models. Again, this is a review from before, but why do we have to have a population estimate? Why can't we just go out and count them? As most of you are probably well aware, just animals inherently hard to find. They have different detection probabilities. But not only that, their populations constantly change. I mean, if you went out and you had a perfect census on October 1st, 2 months later, you're going to have the population size is going to change between those two time periods because of things like birth, not birth in the fall, but mortality, births in the spring. You might have movements, so things like immigration and emigration, out of the population and into the population. Those are things we typically quantify as sort of movements. The other reason we use the models is we want to know the number of males and the females in the population so that we can determine our harvestable surplus. So that's where we get our quotas from in our current system. But we also might be interested in other things, not just the total population size. We really want to know what's the fawn recruitment doing. What are the trends in fawn recruitment doing? Is it on an upward trend? Is it on a downward trend? Is it highly variable? We can also use that recruitment data to look at age class data for bucks, for instance. So, just because you have 30 bucks per 100 does in your population, which is maybe your management objective, you really want to know how is the age distribution. Are they all 2-year-old deer? Are a lot of them in the middle age class? Do you have an appropriate number of adult, mature males? And that recruitment value reflects your age class. So we use the models for that purpose as well. So our current model system is what we call a deterministic spreadsheet model, sometimes referred to as an accounting model. It doesn't use statistical estimators and things like that. It's basically, just purely mathematical, no estimation. But we do use sort of assumptions and things like that when we don't have data. But what that entails is you basically have to start with a baseline population number. So for us, in where we're at in Nevada now, we've relied on previous population estimators. There was software before called POP2 that generated these numbers. They used a change in ratio in the early 80s to generate these numbers. So that, for us, is basically where we're starting. You can also just use raw count data if you have a good estimate. From there, our models are highly driven by our spring fawn recruitment. In fact, that is the driver of the population numbers. And we use that directly from our spring survey counts. We just plug them directly into the model. The harvest data is generally, we're subtracting all the harvested animals that we know we have. Again, we can use an expansion factor if we don't have over 90% harvest data. If we have a doe harvest, we subtract the does. If we have a buck harvest, we subtract the bucks, and then we actually proportionalize that to the different age classes. So that gives us a number going into the fall hunting season. That's our pre-hunt population estimate. We have to make certain assumptions. If we don't have data on the survival of adults, we use published literature. If we have direct measures like radio collar data, we might use the radio collar data for the survival. Things like birth rates and immigration, we just have to make assumptions there. And this is the bullet there, no measure of variance or uncertainty. That's probably the biggest downfall of our current modeling system. We don't really have a true measure of uncertainty on the individual parameters like the fawn ratios, and we don't have a measure of uncertainty on the population size itself. So confidence levels. You can think of these as an analogy. A good analogy is things like a margin of error in a political poll. So for our population estimate, we say there's hypothetically 10,000 deer in the population. We really don't know, plus or minus, what the true population parameter is given that confidence interval. But we do have a way to check and balance. Just because we don't have the confidence levels don't mean we're not, worried about that number. So we have this calibration method where if our predicted buck ratio varies substantially from what we observe on our postseason ratio, then we can correct the model by adjusting the population size up or down. And here's a little simple example of this. There are some assumptions in here, but if we just had a hypothetical population estimate of 1,000 animals, our observed ratio of 30 bucks, 100 does, and 40 fawns, that would roughly give us a pre-hunt population of 176 bucks, 589 does, and 235 fawns. If we know that we remove 30 bucks from the population by harvest, and then we go out in the postseason and we count that number, that should result in an observed buck ratio of 25 per 100. Now, if we're wildly off of that, either high or low, we'd be tipped off that our population estimate might be slightly off. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is. There could be, we would look at other things like the success rate and maybe the weather, things like that. But that is an indicator that our population model might need to be, or our number might be adjusted. So this is really where I'm kind of going forward with things. So we know that there's some weaknesses with our current models. We've explored other models. I went out and visited with folks from WAF representatives from Colorado and Utah, other states as well, and a lot of states are using a model selection process. It's a statistical estimator. It uses very similar parameters, inputs that we collect in Nevada. You start with a baseline population number. Now, here's the critical difference on this little bullet here that says an independent abundant estimate from the count data. Currently, when we go out and we fly, we do count the total number of animals, but that isn't directly related to the population estimate for our current system. We're pretty much condensing all that information down into a ratio, the buck ratio or the fawn ratio, which for our management purposes suits us well. However, we're actually losing an opportunity right here at this point to actually use the count data. Now, if you have correction factors, or you use a Mark Reside or a quadrat-based survey, you can actually estimate your population directly at that point in time, directly from your count data by a simple correction factor. It might be citability of 40% given the conditions. That's what Colorado and Utah uses. They use quadrat-based helicopter survey methods largely. But you're not done there. As I mentioned, populations change, so you still have to account, for different survivals of fawns and adults. They typically use radio collars for that. That projects number of deer, population estimate, and it gives you a confidence interval. So instead of saying 10,000 deer, it might say a population estimate of 10,000 plus or minus 2,000. Given a 95% confidence interval or something similar to that. Those modeling brochures also make assumptions, just like a lot of modeling processes do, about birth rates, fecundity, things like summer survival rates if you don't have that data in hand. Are there other modeling processes out there that we could use? There certainly are. The one that's gained a lot of attention recently are what are called integrated population models. And WAFWA really has been funding a lot of the research behind this. A lot of the statistical gurus have been testing this out on sage grouse, but they've been using these for ungulates in other states. Rocky Mountain National Park, for instance, their models use the integrated population models now. Very similar types of data, count data from helicopter surveys, juvenile survival or recruitment, either from radio collars, which is the most reliable, or a ratio type of data like we collect from helicopter surveys. Of course, you want to have your adult survival in there. The harvest is similar to ours. It's subtracted from the population, but it actually also uses the sort of the variance in the harvest, which is something we don't currently use. So if you'll notice even in our status book, hunt success might vary from year to year. It could go up, it could go down slightly. It actually used that type of variance in the estimate. I'm not going to get into the weeds of what Bayesian statistics are. It's fairly complex mathematically. But what this IPM does is it basically takes all of these data sources and their uncertainty, their measures of variances, and it pulls them together, and it gives you a robust population estimate, and allows you to do different things that our models don't, like project into the future what the population would be predicted to do given a certain harvest level. So on to the quotas. Again, population estimate in our process is an integral part. So there's generally 3 steps. We need to determine the projected animal harvest. This is all done on a unit group basis, by the way, for deer. Our objective might be a male ratio for bucks, percentage of males for other things like bighorn sheep. But basically, we're figuring out the number of bucks we can harvest out of the population. So we apportion the projected harvest into the various weapon classes. And we do that by the previous year's demand. I got another slide that goes into that. But this is all out of Commission Policy 24, I believe, something we've used for many years. We got to expand the harvest to get to the final quota number, so we divide the projected harvest by the previous year's, it's actually the previous 3 years' hunt success. So what do we mean by demand? All that is a measure of how popular these hunts are, how many people want to hunt in that unit with that type of weapon. So we have the archery, muzzleloader, any legal weapon. These are basically sorted in order of efficiency or primitiveness, if you will. I've been told that this doesn't truly represent a Nevada hunter with this any legal weapon icon, but I couldn't find a better one, and the guy just looks so happy that I couldn't resist throwing that in there. But this measure is based on first choice applicants for that hunt for the previous year. First choice only. So, very simple math example here. So after we've determined what our target ratio is, we determine that we have 100 bucks available for harvest. For mule deer in our process, we take the juniors, we basically treat them like a weapon class, and we siphon off 25% of those is what we have been using, what you guys have been approving for the last several years. It varies between 23 and 25%. So right here, I'm taking 23 bucks out and appropriating those to the juniors. That gives us 77 remaining bucks. Now that's not the available, that's the desired buck kill that we want to get, not the bucks in the population that are available for harvest. So if we look at our demand, typically archery is the lowest demand. We have 5% statewide on archery, 10% on muzzleloader, and 85% on any legal weapon. Now this is across the state. On a given hunt unit, these could vary. That gives us these available numbers of bucks, 4, 8, and 65. So we divide in the success rates. So you can see there the average statewide archery success is 20%, 40% for muzzleloader, and 50% for any legal weapon. And so that gives you your final quota there of 20, 20, and 130. And so you can see real easily, just looking at archery and muzzleloader, you get 20 tags, but because the muzzleloaders are more effective, that should result in a desired buck kill of 8 in the case of muzzleloader and 4 in the case of archery, 65 for any legal weapon. So in order to get 77 dead bucks on the landscape from non-junior hunters, you need this quota apportionment given past success rates and demand. So, and finally, the public review and the Wildlife Commission process, I'm sure we're all very, very familiar with this, but just to kind of review it, there are 17 county advisory boards. They receive the NDOW quota recommendations, so we send a packet out to all the cabs at the end of April with our recommendations. Each county holds a public meeting, discuss, take public comment, develop their own quota recommendations, and then these are brought forth to the Wildlife Commission, generally in the second week of May. And the commission meeting includes the final quota determination. So the county advisory boards at that meeting present their official alternative quotas. Commission rules, makes a final decision on the tag quota for all of our draw hunts, which is pretty much everything in Nevada. So that is the process. Then comes the excitement, the actual draw, which is like Christmas in Nevada, for hunters anyway. A lot of excitement around that. Some people are elated, some people are disappointed, but there's a lot of hype around it. People go out and hunt, obviously, and then we start the process again next year. That's all I have. I don't know if we want to take questions now, or do we want to wait till the end? It's up to the chair.
I think we can wait till the end. Go ahead and finish your presentation and round it up with questions. Chairman Wallace, members of the commission, Cody McKee for the record. Thanks for having me. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump into a 2-year process that we've been using to take a close look at our aerial surveys, and kind of going back to what Cody had outlined is trying to fit our surveys into this tight window. As Cody had shown, the Peak of the Rut is about 3 weeks long in November. It overlaps several weekends and holidays. It's a challenge for our biologists to be able to fly surveys within this condensed time frame. And it's important to remember that the reason we want to do that is because we want to obtain the best and we want to obtain unbiased ratios to carry forward in our population estimates. Surveying on either end of that timing, either early or late, could lead to us underestimating our buck ratios and unfortunately under-prescribing tags in certain areas. And so essentially what we've been attempting to do, and that's taking a look at a sample-based survey approach, which is different from what we've been doing, which is called directed search aerial surveys, is we're trying to optimize the timing and the duration of our flights so that we can collect the best data possible, so we can put that into our population models, and then ultimately we want to be able to provide the best recommendations to you guys when you're making your decisions on quotas. And we're also looking at trying to collect the best data possible. And as Cody indicated, the inferences that we can make from our survey data right now is very limited. We use ratios in our population models, but unfortunately right now our population estimates are point counts. As much as we would like to think that we're spot on when we say that there's 10,000 deer in a mountain range, we know that there's variability there, and we'd like to know what that variability might be. So some of the overarching questions that we used when we were going through this process is we wanted to determine what's the optimal count needed for ratios and confidence intervals to stabilize. And what I mean by that is what's the point of diminishing returns? And if we're only looking at ratios, what point do we collect data? Do our ratios no longer improve? And we also looked at confidence intervals. Now, we can apply confidence intervals to our data. However, because of the way that we collect our data, we know that there's bias already built in. So we can use that to evaluate how precise we've been, but we have to take that with a grain of salt, and knowing that the ratios that they're bounding could be biased. And then we want to know if this effort is going to allow us to fly closer to the Peak of the Rut.
And then finally, can we collect these data in a way that's going to help us obtain an accurate ratio with precision that gives us confidence about making inferences about a population? So when I first began, I mentioned that we are currently using a directed search aerial survey in Nevada. And just to give you guys a kind of a brief overview of what that means, imagine these two rectangles are two mountain ranges in Nevada, and both of these mountain ranges comprise a specific management area. When our biologists conduct our surveys, we have some historical knowledge of where deer may exist within the mountain range. We have areas that we've been flying over and over year after year, and there might be time constraints as well, give it needing to move on to another area, weather, etc. And so when we go out, we're flying the areas where we know we're going to find deer. And on these rectangles, it's those areas outlined in blue. And that black line is going to be our flight path. And this is great. You'll see in our status books, we've classified 500 deer on survey, yielding a buck ratio of 27 and a fawn ratio of 45. And that's what we carry forward in our population estimate. And one thing that I would also point out before I get too far in is that this is a very simple explanation of what a directed search aerial survey is. It's typically a little bit more rigorous in the field. But just to give you an idea of what it is, going back to this figure, these white areas, those are areas that didn't get flown. And for our purposes, these are areas that are unknown to us, and in some instances, giving spatial variation on the landscape, the herd composition may be drastically different in those areas. The densities of deers might be drastically different in those areas. And unfortunately, these ratios that we obtain may not be correct, especially if we're unable to fly the entire area. So when we're talking about a sample-based approach, what we're doing is we're dividing these mountain ranges up into polygons or rectangles, and we're saying we want to randomly sample across the entire area. So now we're actually addressing this spatial variation by sampling within all portions of the mountain range rather than specific areas where we have a known density where we know we're gonna get the best count possible. But with this approach, there come some limitations. We may not count 500 deer during that survey. We may only count 300 deer during the survey. But a randomized approach to what we're doing is a statistically valid approach to collecting data. And when we go forward and we're talking about detection probabilities, we can incorporate other things like radio collar data for animals that occur within these polygons to determine what proportion of the deer did we count. We can look at things like cover, snow, wind. All these variables can go into these more rigorous population models for us to better understand not only the ratios, but also the abundance of deer in the mountain range. So going back to what I was explaining, we might not count as many deer. Obviously that's concerning, and I'm sure that some of the cabs here have questions about that. What is it going to mean if we count fewer deer on survey? What if we're not getting record counts year after year after year? Does that mean our deer populations aren't doing well? Well, that's not the case. But what we wanted to show, not only for the audience here, but also our own biologists who were implementing this in the field, is what happens to our data when we're not counting as many animals. So we went back and we reviewed historical data, ratios, and confidence intervals. We also wanted to determine what's the point of stabilization, so what's that optimized point for our ratios. Beyond that, where's our point of diminishing returns? And then finally, how can we develop a survey protocol that will work for Nevada? So what I'm showing here, this is survey data from 2014 in Area 17. All of these values on the left, this percent sampled column, what I've done is I've taken that 2014 data set and I've just randomly pulled data from the data set. I've pulled 1% of the data, 2% of the data, 50% of the data all the way up to 100%. And the 100% actually represents the results in the field, okay? And what we see is that about 50% of this sample, biologists on survey counted about 1,500 deer with a ratio of 35 bucks per 100 does or 32 bucks per 100 does and 35 fawns per 100 does. And what we see is that at only about half of those deer, so if we randomly sample 50% of his data set, we're still yielding ratios with confidence limits that are very similar to the entire data set, the 1,500 deer that were counted. And this is what this looks like on a figure. So again, that x-axis, that bottom bar represents the percent sampled. The left vertical axis represents the ratios. And unfortunately, I don't think this is working up here. But at about 10% of the sample, what we're seeing is ratios are no longer becoming volatile. We're starting to see this straight line relationship all the way out to 100%. So at about 10% of the sample, or 150 deer, we're already yielding ratios that are very similar to the overall ratio that came out of that aerial survey. And then as we follow our confidence limits, they get a little bit tighter and a little bit tighter until we get to about 50% of the overall sample. And that represents approximately 800 to 900 deer. At that point, we don't see any tightening of our confidence limits. So at that point, that's our optimized point right there. If we count 800 deer on this survey in Area 17, we will be yielding ratios and confidence limits that are no better for the entire, if we sampled 100% of the survey. Okay, so now we've taken a look at what happens if we sample fewer animals in a systematic approach. How do we thus apply this to an aerial survey in Nevada? And what we chose to do is to implement a survey design that's used in other states, Colorado and Idaho, among many others. It's essentially a plot-based or a quadrat-based approach. It's based on delineating specific watershed boundaries, dividing up the mountain range in that method. We then bin all of these areas, all of these watersheds occurring within the mountain range into densities of high, medium, and low. And then from those densities of high, medium, and low, we then randomly pull a subset of those plots that would be surveyed in the subsequent flights. So this is what it looks like for Area 17, the Toyabe and the Shoshone ranges. This is an area that Joe Bennett's going to be talking about his results that he had from this last fall's postseason aerial surveys. But this is what it looks like when we divide the mountain range up into these plots or polygons. Again, they're representing watershed boundaries within the Toyabe range. The dark represents high densities. The tannish color represents medium densities, and the yellow represents low density watersheds in the Toyabe range. And we used historical data from 2012 to 2014. We may have used more than that to actually derive these stratifications or these densities to give us an idea of historically how many deer are we counting within these given areas. So from there, we then randomly selected a proportion of each one of these densities of these plots for survey. And this is a retrospective analysis, so I'm going back and looking at our historical data and applying it using this sampling approach. This is an actual survey data results. Joe will be presenting his on-the-ground results. But using this retrospective analysis, we sampled about 55% or 62% of the available plots, and we went back and looked at these plots and the survey data that occurred within each plot to determine what were the resulting ratios that came out of those aerial surveys. And we compared them to the actual survey data collected in 2012 to 2014. So on the horizontal axis, you'll see the actual survey data is the very first point, and then we go across to these various subsamples. Again, subsample 1 is 55% of the available plots, subsample 2 is 55, and subsample 3 is 62%. The vertical axis is our ratio data. And what we wanted to do was show or compare our actual data set to these scenarios of surveying that would have occurred within those given years. And what you'll see is, despite the fact that in general we're only surveying about half as many deer during these hypothetical examples or scenarios, we're still obtaining ratios that are very similar to the actual flight themselves. And so this bar that I just brought up essentially provides you with a perspective on, this would be 2013, our data set from 2013, and how those sampling scenarios compared to the survey, the actual flight itself. And we see this again with our buck ratios. We see very, very similar tracking. One thing to point out, and this is where this inherent bias can come in, is subsample 1 in this record across all years yielded a higher buck ratio than both the actual survey and the other subsamples. And that's where bias gets built into what we're doing if we're only surveying specific areas where a buck ratio may be higher than the actual ratio on the landscape. This can actually drive our results and ultimately the recommendations that we make to you guys. So in summary, we can get the wrong answer if we're using directed search aerial surveys. We know that using a sample-based approach that incorporates randomization can be used to obtain valid buck and fawn ratios for mule deer in Nevada. But one of the things that came up frequently in our evaluation of this process is, what are the things that we're going to lose? And again, we're going to end up losing fewer record counts of our deer. But what we are gaining is a more statistically rigorous approach to collecting aerial survey data. And we're also going to lose a little bit of ancillary information about our mountain ranges. We're not going to be flying the entire areas, but we'll be flying over them. They just won't be as in-depth as what we've historically been accustomed to in Nevada. So with that, I guess we'll move on and have Joe step up and take a look. He'll show you guys a little bit about his success this year flying these survey approaches.
Chairman Wallace, members of the commission, for the record, Joe Bennett, Tonopah game biologist. As Cody alluded to, I'm going to discuss the actual implementation of these polygon-based surveys in Hunt Unit 17 for mule deer. So, the survey results for Area 17 for the 2016 fall survey was 1,018 deer classified total, with a buck ratio of 30 and a fawn ratio of 61. So first, when one thinks about a randomized survey, you have to delineate your hunt unit or areas into areas that can be stratified or brought out and randomized. So there were a total of 55 polygons that were delineated for Hunt Unit 17 with 173 and 172. And the blue represents the high densities, the gray is the medium densities, and the orange pinkish color is the low densities. And these are all deer per kilometer. So from those 55 polygons that were stratified, we extrapolated 23 randomly, with 17 being in Hunt Unit 173 because of the higher densities that occur in Hunt Unit 173, and then 6 in 172. In 173, there were 7 high-density plots, 6 medium-density plots, and 4 low-density. Area, or in Hunt Unit 172, there was 2 high, 2 medium, 2 low. And the first question you might be asking yourself is, this is approximately 40% of the total survey area or number of plots. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's 40% of the deer sampled because of the higher proportion of high-density plots that were taken out. So next, or going back, these plots were all derived from the previous 5 years aerial survey data. 73 and 172. Next, I overlaid the actual track logs or flight paths coupled with the deer observations, which is in light green, and the darker strings that are as a flight path. You can see, as predicted, high density plots and density plots. This graph indicates the confidence intervals or the variance estimates of the retrofitted data on the x-axis and the new methodology on the x-axis of 2016, and the y-axis is the ratios. One thing that you first notice is that the variance estimates don't change much among years. They're very similar, meaning that we weren't necessarily making mistakes beforehand, but as Cody alluded to with our conservative nature and then the possible inherent bias, the new methodology incorporates group size as a sampling unit, factors. So comparison to the most recent survey in 2014, on that survey they classified 1,300. And you could see that it actually took a little longer to conduct the survey. So similar. And that may have been because it was a new survey. We were mostly within the polygon. So one thing I probably failed to mention is that once we randomized the polygons themselves, the survey conducted within the polygons is topography and elevation. So it's not necessarily as randomized within themselves. And then here's a comparison of the 2014 survey versus the new methodology, and again, as Cody, the first thing you might observe is the gaps of the areas. And that's just the product of the randomization of the process. So each year, you're going to have a different subset of polygons, meaning that you might not have that ancillary habitat data. The strengths of this methodology is it objectively directs the survey area. It's a statistically rigorous method for data collection and a defensible method. And it's kind of a not seeing some areas, you get to see some areas that are not well, and those areas were located in the polygons as usually low density areas that have so as Cody Schroeder alluded to, this data can be easier to improve among biologists and among years. Some of the challenges that we found is that possible net loss of ancillary habitat and species distribution information. Some of the added distractions for flight clues that we're trying to smaller GPS units, seeing these polygon boundaries. The polygons themselves, as you noticed, were pretty jagged. That was because there was a gradient that was placed on it. That was because that encompassed the area of all of it. So in future, we're going to maybe reference it and have the polygon area boundaries as more line or ridge lines. Just easier to observe shift. Survey intensity may increase in years. Had great snow cover this year. Some elevational boundaries. Dry conditions, you're not able to see tracks and things like that. The initial exploration did not reduce flight times. And the public's perception, the loss of that you may see in areas that aren't covered, that possible loss of ancillary. Some of the logistics that we're trying to improve is, like I said, it took longer on survey, so modify the flight protocol in areas that are heavily treed, maybe have a higher above ground level, and have faster speeds, and then in areas where you have good conditions, you can fly things that we're exploring. And again, as I alluded to, simplify the plots to reduce pilot distractions. Data collection, so we tried some new things such as detection probabilities, different variables, and that became somewhat cumbersome to seed individual. So we're trying to work through some of those hindrances by maybe we can extrapolate some of that data from traffic information systems such as fitting all the flights into an optimal period, flying on weekends, and there's got to be some to see when that optimal period is.
Now, just to try and kind of wrap this up, I do have a few more slides, but what I want to talk about is hitting the target here just a little bit. You know, well, it was 2 years ago, I introduced the concept of trying to get the commission to affirm what targets we're trying to hit, and concept I started to discuss was harvest guidelines. There was probably far more complex than it needed to be. However, we wanted to kind of introduce the commission and the cabs and try to have everybody on the same page as you know, kind of the science we use to get to where we're trying to reach. And as we kind of went through this presentation, I was kind of taking a few notes, and I hope it's apparent. There's a number of places throughout this that we introduce conservatism into the approach that we're using now. One of those things is that we use a post-hunt buck-to-doe ratio. We don't use the buck-to-doe ratio before the hunt. And so in most of the units that we're managing today, we're managing for 30 bucks per 100 does or higher. And even the buck-to-doe ratio itself at 30 bucks per 100 does is higher than what most states manage towards. It's certainly within the range of biological acceptability, but that actual number that you shoot for, while there's an awful lot of science and a lot of investment that goes into it, that 30 bucks per 100 does is a social decision that the commission chooses to establish. If we miss the peak rut, what we typically see is a lower buck-to-doe ratio, and so that's what we're measuring. And so, again, we're adding conservatism into this. The fact that when we calibrate our models to meet that, what that does is reduce populations and our estimated populations, and again, additional conservatism is added into it. And finally, we survey substantially more effort. We put more effort into the survey than what is statistically necessary. We go well beyond our minimums, and so the confidence we have in the estimates that we do derive are very high. You know, the helicopters that we looked at yesterday afternoon play a very important role in our ability to do this, and the quality of our pilots, the quality of our personnel. I'd like to just come back real briefly and talk about those targets a little bit. We've invested a fair degree in technology. We spent $250,000 on that helicopter with the support of a lot of our folks, a lot of our partners. We're investing in improving the survey methodologies. We're investing in our modeling processes. We've sought outside review of the techniques that we're using. And we want to continue to collect the best science that we can and get the best equipment and do the best job we can at it. Decisions are informed by science, but those targets, ultimately, they're the ones that are socially driven. And so I just wanted to remind the commission and the CABs of what some of our current modeled and our current targets are. And within the Pronghorn plan, it says that we'll manage for 20 to 30 total bucks per 100 does. Currently, we're managing for a more conservative buck-to-doe ratio, and we're using a modeled population for the 2-year-old and greater. With bighorn sheep, the plan itself did not define any, and yet what we're trying to do is manage for those older age class harvests, and looking at that, no more than 8% of the total population in doing it. A very conservative approach again. No plan exists for the mountain goats, but our current guide is that we will harvest no more than 2 to 5% of the population. Our bear harvest, the commission has repeatedly informed us to manage that at a light level. Elk species, the species management plan dictates that we manage for 15 to 40 bulls per 100 cows. We are dramatically higher than that in virtually every unit of the state. And so what we're currently looking at is that 25 to 35% of those harvested bulls in virtually every unit is 50-inch main beam or longer. So we've got an older age class structure there as well. We have no we have draft mule deer plans, but we don't have any finalized mule deer plans. But in most units, we're managing for 30 to 100. There are several units that we've noted that we're managing in a more conservative fashion. And finally, we are following some direction on the commission regarding the lion management plan or the lion management that we've implemented. At this point in time, the department will continue to use those objectives moving forward. If the commission would like the department to present those in a setting in which you could provide us additional direction to deviate from those, we would certainly be glad to come back and try and do that. Those quotas, the guidelines associated or the targets for the quotas are separate from seasons. The commission has established the seasons once every 2 years and does not need to be part of the quota targets that we're trying to achieve. But for the department's needs, it would be really useful if the commission chose to deviate from the targets that we've perceived that we're shooting for. We'd certainly be willing to come back and provide more opportunity for input on that. Otherwise, it would be our intent to move forward and continue with the targets that we've perceived now. That concludes the presentation. Any of us would be willing to entertain any questions that the commission may choose to have on any aspect of it.
Thank you, Mr. Wakeling and Mr. Bennett and Cody for a great presentation. And I'm going to bring it up to the commission for potential questions, and then I'll take it to the CABs and any other questions we may come up with. Any questions from the commission for any of the gentlemen? Mr. Hubbs.
I had one for Cody Schroeder in regard to the integrated population modeling, and when exactly, I mean, I know you're studying a lot of different moving parts right now, but when do you project if you're going to put in a statistical estimate or a model that's using that type of estimate? I'm assuming you would do it in tandem with the accounting model until you felt comfortable that those numbers were near or around the same. Do you know in the future when that might be integrated or applied, or are you even there yet?
For the record, Cody Schroeder, Department of Wildlife. I don't have a projected timeline. We just recently, honestly, began exploring these. We've been in discussions with UNR, some grad students at University of Nevada, Reno. We've also talked to some researchers from Montana. We certainly would be, it's not like we would dump our old models and just throw them away and never look at them again. I mean, we would probably use them for several years, and ideally they would show the same number. If we're doing a perfect job, but they may be estimated up or down. So they certainly would be incorporated in tandem. In terms of a timeline, I mean, we're really looking. We had our summer coordination meeting and kind of agreed